Good evening. It's good to be here with you. That's Dan Reed back there, my friend from Columbus, Ohio, and his brother. It's good to have you, Dan. And your trip here is worth embarrassing you in front of everyone and calling you out. So thank you for being here today. All of you, it's good to see you. Thanks for coming and being with us. Had a good afternoon this afternoon. Was able to spend about an hour in study before the lesson and just review everything. Spent some time with the Roogs and got to know them better and their a nice family. And I'm looking forward to the week and getting to know Daniel and Beth and Alice and Lily and Daisy and Paul and Luke better this week. And so I'm excited to be with them. Also had a good lunch. In fact, I'm somewhat full. I'm probably not as full as Brother Marshall. In fact, I'm very impressed that he was up here leading singing. You should have seen the pot of food that he was eating from. It looks like something you bring to a potluck, and it was for him, all for him. But I had a good time with them and enjoyed it. It's good to be here with you here today. Though the people had returned to Jerusalem from Babylonian captivity, the situation was very dire in the days of Nehemiah. The protective stone walls surrounding the city of Jerusalem were broken down. And because of that, the enemy nations were all around and even within the city. The people were too broke, they were too bullied to rebuild. God's people, because the walls were broken down, and this was their primary method of defense, they were vulnerable to attack. They were hanging on by a thread. God's people were afraid. God's people were in a situation where they very easily could have become captives all over again after all of the time and the hope and the prayer that was spent so they could come back to Jerusalem. But far away from the capital of Persia, there was a devout Jew who traveled to Jerusalem and who brought hope. And after surveying the city and its damages, Nehemiah calls together the officials of the Jews. And Nehemiah in chapter 2, verses 17 and 18, it records these words. It says, "Then I said to them," this is Nehemiah with all the officials of Jerusalem, "You see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire. Come and let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them of the hand of my God, which had been good upon me, and also of the king's words that he had spoken to me. And so they said, let us rise up and build. And then they set their hands to this good work." Well, 52 days later, after he's called this session with these men, the wall was rebuilt and the people were on the path to not only the physical restoration of Jerusalem, but the spiritual restoration of the nation of Israel. Now, Nehemiah may have lived over 2 millennia ago, but these are there's still great lessons that we can learn from him for our instruction today. And that's our theme for this week. We're going back to the Old Testament in these lessons. And we are considering people who can be examples for our instruction. Whether they're bad examples that we need to avoid or whether they're good examples that we need to imitate, we are learning from the characters of the Old Testament this week, as the Apostle Paul told us to, and we are gaining comfort and hope and instruction from their examples. As you think about Nehemiah, God's people owed a great debt of gratitude to Nehemiah for his leadership, for his insistence upon doing the right thing, for his indomitable will, which would not be shamed into quitting. And we can learn some wonderful leadership lessons from Nehemiah. And I think we need to learn lessons about leadership, considering the situation that our world is in today. Marriages are on the brink of failing. Sometimes that's leadership issues. Homes are crumbling. Sometimes that has to do with leadership. The nation is tottering, and sometimes that has to do with leadership. In many places, the church is struggling. And while we could point to various things, sometimes the struggles of churches have to do with leadership or lack of leadership. We need leaders like Nehemiah in the home. There's lessons we can learn in the home from Nehemiah. We need them in the nation, and we need them in the church. Men and women who, instead of giving up, encourage people together to say, let us rise up and build, and have the will to rise up and build. So what does it take to have that will? Well, I think we don't have to look much further than Nehemiah. So hopefully you're already there. We already had a reading from Nehemiah Chapter 1. We're going to be looking primarily at Nehemiah Chapters 1 and 2 today, and just glancing at a couple of other things. But let's think about what Nehemiah's will to rise up and build involved. Well, first of all, as you think about Nehemiah's will to rise up and build, the first thing that I want you to notice as we read the book of Nehemiah is that it started with a concern for others. Look at Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 1. It says the words of Nehemiah, so we know who the author is here. It tells us when this was written. It tells us where it was written, Shushan, the citadel. And it says in verse 2 that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. Notice Nehemiah from the get-go is showing good leadership in a very basic way. He cares about people. He cares about people who have survived difficult situations. Many of these people have been captives. He cares about people who have escaped the danger and the sadness of captivity. He cares about Jerusalem, which was the city of where many of these people would live. It was the holy city. And so Nehemiah's leadership begins with a concern for people. Sometimes people seem so careless about what's going on around them. Sometimes it can seem as though we are so apathetic concerning the walls that are crumbling in around us. Look at Proverbs chapter 24. Do you remember the field of the lazy man? As you look at the field of the lazy man in verse 30, the writer of Proverbs says, I went by the field of the lazy man and by the vineyard of the man devoid of understanding, and there it was, all overgrown with thorns. Its surface was covered with nettles. Its stone wall was broken down. That's exactly the situation Jerusalem is in. Stone wall was just broken down. And when I saw it, I considered it well. I looked on it. I received instruction. And he pinpoints one of the problems is that a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, so shall your poverty come like a prowler. You need to do something if you're the man living in the house where the wall is breaking down and the thorns are overgrowing the home. You need to do something about that house, but the problem is you're apathetic, you're lazy, you don't seem like you care. Spiritually speaking, hopefully we see the parable here. When there's problems that are going on in our homes and in our churches and in our nation, then we need people, first of all, it just starts with this, who care. We care when we see those problems. We're concerned when we see those issues. We're disturbed when we see the problems. We've got to care enough about the problem to investigate and to help correct it. So Nehemiah compassionately cared enough, and notice what he does because he cares, to ask Hanani and his visiting brethren from Judah about the situation in Jerusalem. And so if you want to be a leader, can I suggest that one of the things that you need to do as you exhibit and demonstrate leadership is you need to have two important questions etched into your mind. First question is this: be willing to ask people when we sense that there are problems, how are you doing? And mean it. I'm not talking about just asking that as they pass through the back doors of the church building and then asking it again next week, next time we see them. If you see the distress on people's face, if you know that there are problems in their lives, somebody's lost their job, somebody's struggling with cancer or sickness, somebody has just lost a loved one, somebody is discouraged in their faith and they're around bad influences that are tearing down their faith, You see that written on their face. You know that perhaps that's going on in their life, though you don't know to which degree. Be willing to ask, how are you doing? And don't accept a flimsy, fake answer. No, really, how are you doing? I want to know about you. And secondly, second question, because it's not enough to just say, well, how are you doing? And then somebody reveals all the problems that are going on in their lives to you. Maybe it's good to take somebody aside to talk about some of those things as well, and to really have a deeper conversation than we can have the surface level conversations that sometimes we have here. But the second question is, well, what can I do to help then? How can I help you guys with this problem that you're facing? What can I do? We can get so interested in the process of life that we can forget our main mission is people. Love God, love people. That's the two great commandments. You know, one of the things I appreciate about the elders where I'm at, I as some of you know, I had COVID during the month of August. I was sick with a fever for 2 weeks. I ended up going to the hospital for 6 days and got better after I went to the hospital. But I was very concerned when I had COVID. I was very concerned because I've only been at the congregation where I'm at for about 6 months. And I was concerned that, you know, out of those 6 months, I've already held 3 gospel meetings. I've been on 3 Sundays. And here I am. I've got COVID and I can't preach for 3 straight Sundays. And I'm thinking, oh man, the preacher's already taken a sabbatical and he just got here. What are these elders going to think about me? One of the things I appreciated about all of them, because I expressed that concern, I really hate putting this on you, but I'm still sick. I don't feel good. And they said, we're not worried about that. We want you to get better. So you just worry about you getting better. Don't worry. You're going to get paid. Don't worry about that. We're not worried about filling the pulpit. We're elders, and we have teachers here. And that's why God equipped the church with some people other than the preacher, because there's times that other people need to step up. We're not worried about that. We're worried about you. And I appreciated that, because it wasn't about the process. Oh boy, well, you're at your 4 weeks of vacation. You've got 4 weeks. You're getting close to where we're going to have to cut you off. They cared about me, not the process. And Nehemiah cares about the people there. He could have just enjoyed his little cupbearer job where he was living in the palace and working with the king and not even showed any bit of concern. But he cared about the people of his homeland and cared about what was going on with them. That's a big part of leadership, is caring about people, loving people. The second thing that we might consider with Nehemiah is that he openly identified the problems. And there were problems that needed to be identified. In Nehemiah Chapter 1, in verse 3, they said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. Here's the problem. So they express this problem, and notice that Nehemiah goes and actually investigates this problem firsthand for himself. He confirms that this is indeed the truth. Sometimes people tell you the problem, and it's not always the full story of the problem. And so sometimes it's good to maybe ask a few questions and do a little bit more inquiring to find out. Nehemiah does that. Look at Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 12. And it says, back up to verse 11, I came to Jerusalem. I was there 3 days. And I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem, nor was there any animal with me except the one on which I rode. And I went out. He personally goes out by night through the valley gate to the serpent well and the refuse gate, and I viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates, which were burned with fire. And then you get down to verse 17. It shows you other places where he's been. He's gathered up all of the officials of the Jews and the nobles, and he's confirmed what he had heard. You see the distress that we are in. Jerusalem lies waste. Its gates are burned with fire. Listen, Good leadership is willing to not pretend that there are no problems. Listen, a simple phrase that I heard one time, and it's always stuck with me, is where there are people, there are problems. Every church is going to have its problems. Every marriage is going to have its problem. Is there anyone here who's married who's never had a problem? Okay, because if you're that person, I'd like to talk to you before the week is over. But where there's marriages and families, there are problems. But we got to be honest about the fact that there's a problem. And we've got to be willing to identify it. Staying in denial is not going to help. I know when I have a Bible study with someone, and we're getting together to study, and we're starting to talk a little bit about perhaps differences or misunderstandings, or I know whether or not in the first study, whether I'm going to make some progress studying with them based on their attitude. If they are arrogant and prideful and pretend they don't need any help, they are going to be difficult to help until they begin to be honest about the fact that there are areas where I can improve and where I can change. That's true of when I study with somebody about marriage issues, or when we study about doctrinal issues, or we're just studying with an unbeliever who needs to be saved by Jesus Christ. If you have an arrogant, prideful attitude, then it's difficult to help you. The same is true with any problem situation. You've got to see it, you've got to identify it, and you've got to admit it before you can fix it. Sometimes it takes someone else seeing it and pointing it out to you. When we sold our house earlier this year, the realtor came in the door, looked down at the floor. We have this wood floor that was in our kitchen, and there was blue tape on the floor, blue painter's tape. And the realtor looked down and said, "What's that blue painter's tape for?" I said, "Well, when I put the floor in, I didn't put the vent in, the register in the floor, and so I've been meaning to cut that thing into the floor for a while." And he says, "Well, you'll need to fix that because there needs to be a vent in your kitchen, right?" So I fixed it. I had forgotten about the blue tape on the floor. We were just walking over that blue tape for the past 2 years. I didn't even ever think about it. But he saw it from a distance, something that I kind of had just neglected over time, and he helped me fix it. You know, sometimes people see the warning lights on their dash. We drove a van around for 6 years, and here's a little tip. If you drive a Honda Odyssey van and you see a yellow light, if it's not flashing, it's okay. We drove around with a yellow light for 6 years. It was okay. But if it starts flashing, you got a problem. But sometimes people see that, and they smell the funny smells and the smoke rising from their hood, and they still won't pull over until the car won't drive anymore. When you see the warning signs, you've got to start fixing the problem. There's some warning signs that I think churches need to think about, and you can add to this list, but I just thought of a few right off the top of my head. When there's no youth in the church, that's a warning sign. And we need to start evangelizing to the younger generation and trying to bring in the younger generation, because if we don't, after a few years, there may no longer be a local church. I'm sure some of you have seen that. I know I have. Church where I started preaching when I was 16. I used to preach once a month, and I did that from age 16 to age 22. That church is no longer there. You got to see the warning signs. When there's no elders in a church, that's a warning sign. And we need some leadership. When there's church cliques, that's a warning sign that there's division in a church. When there's uncorrected immorality, when there are people not living right and no one is addressing it or correcting it, that's a warning sign. When there's a lack of dedication or commitment, we just can't get people to do anything, that's a warning sign. When there's lonely widows and widowers who feel as though they're neglected, look, pure religion is visiting the widows and the orphans. That's a warning sign. When there's burnout preachers, that's a warning sign. When there's doctrinal ignorance or compromise, we could go on and on. But there's some things that we just have to be real honest about with the church, not because we're just complaining about it, but because we see that there's a problem, and we have to consider what's God's plan for how we can help fix that problem. What's the solution? Nehemiah and his brethren openly identified the problems that existed in Jerusalem and didn't try to pretend there was no problem at all. Notice the third thing about Nehemiah's leadership. It was aided by the power of prayer. Notice verse 4. When I heard these words, I hear there's a problem. What is his first thing that he does? Well, let's get the officials together, guys. How are we going to handle this? Actually, no. First thing he does is he prays. When I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned, and I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. We already read the rest of chapter 1 during the reading, but the key point that I want you to see about chapter 1 is that Nehemiah's first reaction to problems is, let's pray about this. That's good leadership. It is a vain and foolish pride which causes us to think that we can just fix life on our own. We don't need to pray to God. You know, we call the plumber when our drains need fixed, and we call the electrician when we have electrical issues, and we call our attorney when we have legal issues. And the reason why is because they often know more about how to fix the situation. They have more wisdom about handling the situation than we do. Well, we have a creator who knows far more than we do, who sees the future before we do, who is our creator and knows what is best for us. So we should pray, seek out his wisdom and help in the midst of trials. One of the things that's awesome about the first century church, you know, we talk sometimes when we study the book of Acts about restoring New Testament Christianity. Here's what they did in evangelism, and here's the plan of salvation they taught. Have you ever noticed how much they prayed? If you want to restore New Testament Christianity, one of the things that's very obvious to me about the first century church is that so many times when there was a problem, they prayed. They prayed about everything. It's all over the book of Acts. And sometimes we miss that because we're focused on other teaching points that we want to make, but prayer needs to be one of those points. They're a praying church. And Nehemiah was a praying person. He humbled himself. He confessed and prayed for God to provide the open door to fix what he knew was in disrepair. Well, as we go on, we think a little bit about another good quality of Nehemiah, and that is he seized providential opportunities. Sometimes you pray about something, God is really providing an answer to that prayer, but then we don't act on it. There have been times when I felt as a preacher that things got kind of dead, and I've thought, it doesn't seem like I've been studying with anyone lately, and we haven't had a visitor walk through the door, which makes that pretty easy sometimes. And there's times that I'll just pray. I said, Lord, send me somebody. Okay, send me somebody that I can work with who wants to hear the truth. And I'll tell you what, almost every time I pray that, within days, there's someone somehow who enters their way into my life, whether it's through the back door of a building, whether it's through a member who's trying to help someone through a problem, or someone that I just happen to meet, just sitting at a kid's ball game sometimes this has happened, where we just are involved in a conversation, and the Lord sends me opportunities, and in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I prayed for it, now it's time for me to do something with it. I've got to act on it. We cannot sit on our hands and just let opportunities walk out the door. Now listen to this. Nehemiah has been praying in chapter 1 about his people who are suffering, praying that there'd be a way that they could get help. And in Nehemiah chapter 2, when you get to this chapter, it says that Nehemiah is serving before the king, and he says in the end of verse 1, I had never been sad in his presence before. And so the king said to me, why is your face sad since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart. The king strikes up a conversation with the guy who's serving him his drink, which can be somewhat rare. King has other people to talk to, other dignitaries, other officials. This is just the butler. This is just the cupbearer that we're talking about here. They're just the servers. But this king notices something different about his server that day, and he asks him a question. And so in verse 3, I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste and its gates are burned with fire? Nehemiah answers the question. Then the king said, here's the bigger question, not just what's wrong with you. And then the king doesn't just say, oh, well, that's too bad. Goes back to talking to more important people. The king says, well, what do you request? And the king has the power to answer the request, right? He's got a lot of money. He's got a lot of workers. He's got a lot of resources. And so what does Nehemiah do? I prayed to the God of heaven. Doesn't pray a long prayer like he did in chapter 1. He probably prays something just like that in his mind as he's having the conversation. Oh, Lord, I prayed. You're answering. Help me to answer wisely. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. Now, that's a big ask for a guy that just serves drinks, okay? Can you send me with the resources to go rebuild a wall? And the king said, how long will your journey be? When will you return? And it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. That's God's providence. And that is a man seizing God's providence when the opportunity arises. Nehemiah seizes the opportunity. If we pray for opportunities, we have to seize opportunities, or our answered prayers often become like unwanted gifts, where we receive the answer to our prayers, but then we just put them on a shelf or in a closet, never to use them again. It may be something as simple as a question that someone asks you about your faith, about why you believe, why you do, why you dress, why you talk the way you do, why you raise your kids the way that you do. It may be a question, it may be a conversation, it may be a suggestion, which opens the door, but we need eyes to see the opportunity when it exists and have the courage to walk through that door with optimism that it's the God of heaven above who's opened the door for you. So if we're going to build, then we need to have the presence of mind like Nehemiah to seize the opportunities God opens before us. Colossians chapter 4 and verse 3, just a quick phrase that Paul writes in this letter. He says this in verse 3. Meanwhile, he says, pray for us that God would open to us a door for the word to speak the mystery of Christ. Pray. That's one thing we should be praying for. God, give us opportunities. Give us open doors. I want to tell you, we're having a gospel meeting this week, and I'm sure that one of the reasons we're having a gospel meeting, right, is you want to do this. You're here because you want to reach out to a lost world. Every visitor that walks in the door this week, and I don't know the members from the visitors well enough to even discern that at this point, but every visitor, every fallen member who just happens to come back because you invited them this week, every child who is here this week because their parents have brought them, every person who's here, whether it be a visitor or a member, during this gospel meeting, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity, if there's fellow members and brothers, for you to encourage and stir people up to love and good works. It's an opportunity if we're talking to lost people to try to win those lost people to Christ. It's an opportunity if we're talking to fallen people to try to ask them, have you thought more about the situation that you're in? And do you know that I love you and we've been praying for you? And we're so glad you're here. Is there something we can do to help? Every young child that's here, it's so good that you're here. I'm so glad to see you. Encourage them for making the right decision and being here to study God's word and to be with God's people. Lack of follow-up with these types of opportunities ensures a stagnation in the growth of the church. When we have opportunities that walk through our back doors, man, that's the easiest opportunity you're going to get. They're saying, I'm interested. I want to know something about the Bible. I'm interested in God's people. I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. And so follow up with those people. Seize the providential opportunities that are before you this week. Now, notice a couple of other things. Nehemiah included others in the work. He included others in the work, and I believe that's also important. Look at chapter 2 and verse 17, and then note, Nehemiah doesn't go to Jerusalem and say, well, I've seen the walls are burnt down. I'm just going to start grabbing some bricks and rebuilding this place all by myself. That'd be pretty foolish, wouldn't it? Too big of a job for one person. Too big of a job for Nehemiah. And so what does he do? Something very smart. Verse 17, you see the distress that we're in. Jerusalem lies waste. Come and underline this word if you haven't, us build the wall of Jerusalem. Plural. All of us need to be involved in this work. This is too big for just one person to handle. Just like we cannot do God's work without God, we cannot do God's work without God's people. We're going to study on Wednesday night a little bit about Moses, who was overburdened with judging between the people of Israel all day long. Remember what his father-in-law said? You're going to wear yourself out trying to do all this by yourself. Get other people involved. You're showing bad leadership by not getting people involved. Get other people involved, Moses. And we're going to talk about that more Wednesday. Good churches are the same way. We're not preacher-centric, and we're not even elder-centric. Good churches balance out the workload. Good families, they don't make mom do all the housework. Mom is not just the house worker. It says in the Bible she's actually the house manager. She's telling the kids, here's your job, here's your job, here's your job. Dan, you go mow the grass. She's even giving him a job. All right? I don't know if that's how it works in your house, but that's how it should work, Beth. So if he's not been mowing the yard, I'm just kidding. Good government, not a dictatorship, can be successful when all of its leaders and citizenry are involved in serving for the good of the country. And good leadership includes others in fixing the problems. If you were to keep looking at chapter 3, you would notice that, first of all, the priests and the rulers do set the tone in chapter 3 and verse 1. They are involved in the work. They're not no-shows. They're not delegating to other people and absent themselves. They are involved in the work. In fact, in verse 5, there's a few people that are mentioned that didn't show up who discouraged the work, and they're mentioned for not being there. However, they involved others. In chapter 1 and verse 12, the rulers and priests are there. In verse 12, it mentions the daughters of Shallum. So there's men and women who are involved in the rebuilding of the wall. You know, some of my biggest helpers as a minister, a lot of times are women. The handouts that some of you have with fill in the blanks, and by the way, there's handouts with fill in the blanks for all the lessons. But I emailed that to a retired lady who happens to have a copier machine in her house because she's part of a couple community organizations, and she prints all that for me. And I just pick it up. She prints my bulletins, and she folds them for me. I've had that in 2 different congregations where I've been, where I've had people who have, women who have helped with bulletins, with printing, with Bible class material, with copying, and certainly in a lot of other ways as well. Men and women are involved in the work here. There's specialists that are mentioned in verse 8 and verse 32. There are specialists such as merchants and perfumers and craftsmen. Perhaps they have specialty jobs in the working of the wall or on the gates. Just like in the church, there's people who may be really good because of their education, their profession. It's something where we can see them using that knowledge and that skill and that ability here with the church. I don't ever have to work on electrical issues at our church building. We have 2 electricians who can do all that. I don't ever have to do any plumbing at the church building. We got a plumber. If a situation arises, he can do that. We've got guys, I don't ever post anything to our website. We have a guy there who, that's his job. He works with technology. He works with computers, and so he can do that on a regular basis. He's a specialist, and that's his profession, and he helps, and he's a huge help in that area. I've had that at every congregation I've been in. I've had guys who are really good with computers. I'm not a technology guru, and they stepped up in those areas. People need to spread out the work. Get involved in it. There are people that are good with social media. We've got 4 different people who handle the live streaming at our congregation. One of them is a 17-year-old kid. Guess what? Kids are good with phones and computers. You need some social media stuff done, go find yourself a teenager. because they're on it all the time, okay? And put them to work. I'm not afraid to do that. We need to spread the work out. There's a lot more I could say, but let's just move on. And then the next point I want you to see is Nehemiah's will to rise up and build also involved him overcoming the opposition. When you actually start wanting to do things in the church that are maybe even scriptural but different than what you've done before, you might find some opposition to that. There's always going to be critics in every church. But I'd rather be the type of person who's so busy working I don't have time for complaining than be the one who's complaining and not doing anything. Look at Nehemiah Chapter 2 and verse 19. There's some critics who come, Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem, who say, what is this thing that you're doing? Kind of making fun of Nehemiah. You're going to come down here and really rebuild this wall with a bunch of these ex-captives. This wall is going to be a joke. It's going to fall down. You won't do any good. We have people who tell us that. This gospel meeting that you're having, that doesn't do any good. If you try to knock on doors, that doesn't do any good. Try to have a meeting at the library and try to bring people, well, that probably is not going to do any good. That's probably just going to fail. It won't go anywhere. Look, when you're saying stuff like that, you know what category you're in? Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. I don't want to be in their class. I want to be the Nehemiah. I want to be the guy that says, hey, people, here's something good that we can do. Let's go at it. Let's tackle it. Let's get it done. And Nehemiah does it. You look at chapter 4. Again, Sanballat and Tobiah are mocking. They're actually surprised that Nehemiah has gotten done what he's gotten done. Then look at Nehemiah chapter 6 and verse 2. Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, come, let us meet together among the villages. But they thought to do me harm. And I sent messengers to them, saying, I am doing a great work. I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you? Nehemiah says, no, I'm not going to listen to you complain and criticize and bellyache and moan. I'm just going to keep on working. Hand me another brick. That's the type of people we need in the church, the people who have a let's get it done attitude. I'm going to work. Whatever the Lord gives me to do to work, I want to work. Nehemiah's task began and ended with opposition, but he never allowed it to stop him from doing what God called him to do. I remember somebody who was like that in the New Testament. His name was Jesus. Enemies all the time, all around, asking him questions, trying to trick him, trying to trap him, trying to make fun of what he was doing in this band of little fishermen that he had around him. But Jesus was the one who could pound his chest after he rose from the grave 3 days later and say, I finished what I came here to do, and you didn't stop me. We need people like Jesus in the church. People who do what God has called them to do, don't worry about the discouragement, and people who do it until the finish. And that's our last point. Nehemiah endured to the finish. Look at verse 15 of Nehemiah chapter 6, and it says this, so the wall was finished on the 25th day in 52 days. Built a wall around an entire city with its gates in 52 days. I wish I could get some of those people to work on my house that I'm building right now for me. We signed in February, okay? It's almost been 6 months. One little house. 52 days. They finished a wall around the entire city. So I just want to encourage you to finish. Quitting early usually doesn't help, but it leads to delays and to failure. We need people who are finishers in the church. Good leadership, you're a finisher. We need perseverance. That's one of the things we need to add to our faith is perseverance. What is perseverance? It's finishing. Steadfastness is finishing. Endurance. These are words that are used in the scriptures all the time. And the very idea is people who see things through to the end. There is shame and there is guilt in quitting on a team, on a marriage, on a family, on a church. Feels good to endure, to say we did what we could and we did our best. My daughter Zoe, who's my middle daughter, she in middle school, a handout was going around the room, tryouts for cross country. And my daughter's always not somebody who just likes to run. Like, that's it. You better give her a ball while she runs. Okay? So give her a basketball, give her a soccer ball, but make her just run. Not her thing. But she signed up for it because her friends did. You know what her friends did when the first day of practice came? They all quit. And Zoe said, you know, Dad, all my friends quit. That's why I signed up. I said, oh, really? You signed up. You're going to finish the season. So she kept running. And she finished the season. Why? Because you say yes, then let your yes be yes. And if you say no, then go ahead and let it be no. But when you make an agreement that you're going to do something, do it and finish it. And that's the character that I want to build in my family. You say you're going to do it, do it. Moms and dads, things get tough when your kids get in those teenage years. I know, I have 3 teenagers. 5 years from now, I'm going to be preaching a series on how to raise teenagers because I'm going to be an expert soon. All right? But right now, I'm not ready for that. But don't quit on those kids in the tough teen years. They still need you. They still need your guidance and your nourishment. Don't quit on them. Elders, don't give up just because the work gets tough. Look, shepherds don't run when the sheep are vulnerable. That's where they have to step up and protect more. That's where you're really needed in the midst of the crisis. Teachers, finish your teaching commitment. And husbands and wives, keep the promise you made. There will be failures. There will be times we have to say, I'm sorry. And there will be times you have to say, well, I forgive you. And you've got to move on. But finish what you started. You made a vow. Till death do us part, for better or for worse. Finish what you committed to. And Christians, we can't give up now, but we have to finish our course. Revelation 2:10 says, there is a crown of life laid up for the faithful. And I love what Paul writes to Timothy in the last letter that Paul would have penned in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 6. After all of the opposition, all the persecution, the stonings, the beatings, the shipwreck, the worn out existence of Paul, in verse 6 he says, I am already being poured out as a drink offering. The time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Finish your race. Finish until the end. Don't quit. Don't give up. Let's apply these principles as you think about it. Let's apply these to the problems we face in the home, the nation, and the church. I think if we do that, we'd see change for good. Nehemiah never fixed every problem in Israel. I do think it's important to know that. Look, parents, you probably aren't going to fix every little problem with your kids. They're still going to have some type of a problem as they get older, some type of a weakness that bites them. Elders aren't going to fix every problem that ever exists in a church. There's still going to be problems. People are going to have problems. Nehemiah did not fix every problem. You look at chapter 13, there are still all kinds of problems in Israel. He tried his best, though. He did what he could. He left Jerusalem, I would say, better than when he found it. And look at the last words that Nehemiah pens in the very last phrase of Nehemiah chapter 13. His last written words are, remember me, O my God, for good. I think he knows. I didn't fix everything, God. I wasn't perfect. Nehemiah pulled people by the hair to try to get him to do stuff. Nehemiah wasn't perfect. He messed up too. He needed forgiveness. And the people that he was leading certainly made mistakes. But our goal in life, listen, my goal in life is this phrase. I love this phrase. Whether it's for long-term or short-term tasks, is I'd like to leave anything better off than when I found it. All right? I buy a house. Well, I want to make that house better than when I found it. I want to fix it. I'm just a fixer. I like to fix stuff. I like to make it look better. My kids, I want my kids to be able to say, I'm glad that I had you as a dad. I'm better off because I had you as a dad. If they say that, despite all my mistakes and all my flaws, if one day they say that, man, that's going to mean everything to me. That they remember me for good. My wife, I hope one day she can say, I'm glad that I had you as a husband. You were good for me. And the church, churches that I work with, the individuals that that I've worked with over the years who've gotten to know me, I want them to be able to say that, you helped me. You taught me something. I've grown closer to the Lord because you've helped me. You got me through this. Remember me for good. Even a gospel meeting, I'm only here for 6 days, but I'd like to think that by the end of day 6, even though you don't know me day 1 really, by the end of day 6, you say, I'm glad that we did this. That was helpful to me in some way. You strengthened me. I'm better because I listened to that sermon, or we gathered together and encouraged one another. Maybe it wasn't a sermon. Maybe it was just us talking over dinner sometime, trying to encourage each other that way. Or maybe it's me and Dan hanging out as co-preachers this week and talking about preaching and all that. I want to leave somebody better than when I found him. I studied with a lady earlier this week. We were together, her and another member of our church who's been working with her. We studied together for an hour and a half. I'd like to think that after an hour and a half, she left that study better than when she came an hour and a half before. That's just my goal. Remember me, oh my God, for good. Is there some way in which you have failed in meeting that goal? Where you're afraid that maybe in your community and in your marriage and in your home and in your church, you failed and people are not remembering you for good. They're remembering you for the wrong things because you're failing in some way. You've sinned in some way. Then we have an avenue of forgiveness through Jesus Christ. We can confess our sins so that we might be forgiven and so we can start fresh. And so we can eventually be remembered for good. If you need that tonight, then we invite you to come forward. If you're someone who is not yet in Jesus Christ, then that opportunity is yours as well, to be baptized into Him, to start living a life for good. And if you follow the example of Jesus, you'll be living that life for good. If you're ready to do that tonight, then we would invite you to come forward while we stand and while we sing.